Douglas might refer to the area as a perfect Eden, but he was a practical man. Roads and schools were needed, and the new governor saw to it that they were built. To pay for the many necessary improvements, he required money. Since he could not legally impose a tax, he established a liquor license instead. The population of 400 adults and 600 children rose up in protest. They demanded an elected assembly, and got it, the first such assembly west of Upper Canada. Besides the white population, there were 30,000 Indians on the island who, like most of the coastal Indians, were somewhat less than overjoyed with the white man's presence there. Thefts and killings were frequent, and Douglas relentlessly prosecuted the offenders and meted out punishment. The Indians were impressed. The governor treated them with fairness and impartiality. When the Crimean War erupted in 1853, all eyes in the colony turned anxiously north to the threat from Russian-held Alaska. And still there was a more constant threat, a seemingly ever-present menace: the increased belligerence of Americans to the south. The arrival on the Queen Charlotte Islands of a group of American miners, probably inadvertent, created further tension, and the dispute over San Juan Island was about to become still another major international incident. It was little wonder that European immigrants and Canadians alike were content to remain in the East. But then a committee established to inspect Hudson's Bay Company activities recommended that Britain repurchase Vancouver Island in accordance with the terms of the original agreement. Like an unexpected flood, the news swept across the coast, to be followed by a tidal wave of change created by a still more exciting and dramatic event. Gold was discovered on the Thompson and Fraser Rivers. On March 23, 1858, a group of miners stopped to eat on a sandbar just north of Fort Hope. One of them, a man named Hill, noticed a yellow glint in the moss he was standing on. He panned and found nuggets. He and his companions set to work, and by winter, they'd removed $2 million worth of gold from Hill's bar. Gold fever spread in all directions. From the south came a stampede of miners, gunmen, gamblers, saloon keepers, dance hall girls, and merchants. They streamed north from the brutal, lawless California mining camps. Between May 15th and June 1st, 10,000 men arrived to prospect on the Fraser, with another 15,000 hot on their heels. They were gold crazy. Nothing could stop them. Indians killed 2 French miners, and 40 riflemen left Fort Yale, killed 7 of the Indians, and burnt their village. Now there was no danger too great, no jungle too impenetrable, no journey too long. Anything could be endured for the bright promise of gold. The trail through Oregon, however, had been closed by hostile Indian tribes, so travel to the gold fields was by steamer, and the steamer stopped at Victoria. Suddenly, there were Americans everywhere. They started a newspaper, the Gazette, set up a Wells Fargo Express office, and opened business establishments. Almost overnight, a shack town sprang up. Again, James Douglas and his colonists had to relive the nightmare of annexation by the United States. If the American miners staked enough claims on the mainland, it could be used by their government as a lever to wrench away control from Britain. Acting without authority, Douglas moved to forestall them. He declared the mainland goldfields Crown property. Miners would require a license to operate, and they'd have to get it from him. Douglas's plan worked, and without hesitation he moved quickly to stem the tide of lawlessness that was threatening the mainland. Fort Yale was overrun with thugs and ruffians like Ned McGowan. The Californians carried with them the prejudices of their nation. Chinese miners were used for target practice, and Indians were ruthlessly slaughtered. To the Americans now were added the gold seekers from Britain and Europe and Eastern Canada. Douglas was assisted in his efforts by Britain's decision to declare the mainland a crown colony. Its name was chosen by Queen Victoria. At Fort Langley on November 19, 1858, the new colony of British Columbia was formally proclaimed. Its governor would be James Douglas, who would also retain his post as governor of Vancouver Island. To maintain peace, Douglas formed a police force and obtained a detachment of soldiers. The soldiers were Royal Engineers who could build as well as fight. Under the command of Colonel Moody, the engineers leveled a town site for a mainland capital to be called Queensborough, but Queen Victoria overruled the colonials and chose a different name, New Westminster. It was incorporated in 1860. By then, revenue from the gold rush had stabilized the economies of the colonies, and instead of coming to an end, there was a fabulous new strike in the Caribou Country. At Antler Creek, miners were panning out $10,000 worth of gold a day. The 58ers made a wild dash for the new treasure fields. They were located far to the north, amidst some of the wildest, most inaccessible country on the continent. Because of the distance and the heavy loads of provisions necessary for the trip, no simple trail would suffice as it had on the Fraser. A road was needed, a highway, and Douglas, the Royal Engineers, private contractors, and the miners themselves pooled their energies and resources to build it. It would have to span gorges, cut around sheer cliffs, and traverse steep canyons. The road would be 18 feet wide and 400 miles long. The engineers blasted the roadway into the mountainside. Joseph Trutch, a private contractor, somehow managed to construct a suspension bridge across the Fraser Canyon. When it proved impossible to transport cable over the narrow trails, Trutch wove wire into two 4-inch cables and anchored them with rock towers. To test his structure, a 4-horse team and wagon with a 3-ton load was driven across. The bridge sagged a mere quarter of an inch. The major portion of the highway was completed by 1864. It had cost $1 million. But the Caribou Country had yielded $4 million in a single year. The road ended at the mining town of Barkerville, named after an English prospector, Billy Barker, who had struck it rich there. Billy and his partners had mined $600,000 worth of gold. But Billy was to die poverty-stricken in Victoria. His story wasn't uncommon. What the miners earned, they usually spent on liquor and on women. Barkerville shook to their merrymaking and to the roaring battles that usually ensued. However, the lawlessness that had marked the early days of the Fraser gold rush was not permitted to flourish. Matthew Begbie had been appointed judge of the colony of British Columbia in 1858. The 6-foot-5-inch justice had his own concept of how to maintain law and order. Begbie didn't waste time with the niceties of the law. "The statute books are exceedingly muddled," he said. "I seldom look into them." When a jury at Gilchrist found a prisoner not guilty of murder, Begbie declared, "Prisoner, it is far from a pleasant duty for me to have to sentence you only to imprisonment for life. Your crime was unmitigated, diabolical murder. You deserve to be hanged. Had the jury performed their duty, I might now have the painful satisfaction of condemning you to death." Then Begbie turned his wrath upon the jury. "And you, gentlemen of the jury," he said, "you are a pack of Dallas horse thieves, and permit me to say it would give me great pleasure to see you hang, each and every one of you, for declaring a murderer guilty only of manslaughter." On still another occasion, when the jury brought in a not guilty verdict, Judge Begbie told the prisoner, "You are free, and I warn you not to pursue your evil ways. But if ever again you should be so inclined, I hope you select your victim from the men who have acquitted you." Matthew Begbie was later knighted for his work. But probably the most famous admonition delivered to unruly miners was made at Wild Horse Creek by Judge Peter O'Reilly. "Boys," the judge warned, "I'm here to keep law and order and to administer the law. Those who don't want law and order can get, but those who stay with the camp, remember on what side of the line the camp is. For, boys, if there is shooting in Kootenai, there will be hanging in Kootenai." After Begbie and O'Reilly brought their brand of justice to the goldfields, the camps were much quieter. Below the border, the cannon and musket fire had reached a bloody crescendo as a civil war raged with unrelenting fury. In the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada, Thomas D'Arcy McGee warned, "That shot fired at Fort Sumter on the 12th of April, 1861, had a message for the North as well as for the South." Politicians in the East, spurred on by that message, clamored for a confederation of all the provinces. In 1864, Sir John A. Macdonald stated, "We cannot delay it. The union of the colonies of British America under the sovereign is a fixed fact." And D'Arcy McGee added, Who will oppose? Who are now opposed to our union? Only those who have a vested interest in their own insignificance. The colonies on the Pacific drowned out the noises of war and the distant drum roll of nationalism with a cry of their own. Island versus mainland. From its inception, British Columbia had resented the rule of a governor who resided on Vancouver Island. After 1863, governors were appointed for each of the colonies, but the antagonism remained. As gold from the Fraser and Caribou trickled out, the colonies' overinflated economies collapsed. The mainland was partially sustained by new finds in Kootenay and Big Bend regions. Vancouver Island, however, found no relief from its depression. The competition for trade between Victoria and New Westminster only aggravated the situation. London suggested the two colonies unite, and one of the most colorful characters in the history of British Columbia supported that recommendation. He was an ex-Nova Scotian named Willie Smith who'd been bitten by the gold bug. He'd crossed the continent to work in California, but didn't find any gold. Like thousands of others, he was swept along in the Fraser gold rush, but again failed to strike pay dirt. By that time, he'd changed his name to a more glamorous-sounding Amour de Cosmos. The self-styled lover of the world started a newspaper. In the British Daily Colonist, he attacked the autocratic rule and policies of James Douglas and the Hudson's Bay Company. His phrase for the establishment was the Family Company Compact. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1863 and afterwards fought a vigorous battle for union of island and mainland. Eventually, Amour de Cosmos was to become Premier of British Columbia. On November 19, 1866, the two colonies were officially united. The union did little to reduce their animosity or their debts. If British Columbia could not survive alone, there were two alternatives. Submit finally to the overtures of a prosperous United States, or join in a Canadian Confederation. Even before July 1, 1867, the mainland had favored union with Canada. Vancouver Island opposed it. But as the years progressed and the area sank deeper and deeper into the mire of economic depression, the colony's 15,000 citizens began to listen to the voices from the other side of the Rockies. There was, as usual, the added incentive of a new threat from their neighbors to the south. The Civil War had ended, and the United States, with the largest standing army in the world, could once again consider its manifest destiny in terms of expansion northwards. President Ulysses S. Grant was openly suggesting that a part of Canada be handed over as reparation for American claims against Britain. And the United States Senate had already decided it would spend $6 million to buy the Canadian West, and another $2 million to cover British Columbia's debts. As the Americans saw it, annexation was simply a question of time. The long-awaited decision in the San Juan dispute added to the discomfort of the pro-British colonists. The Washington Treaty had stated that the boundary south of Vancouver Island was to be the middle of the channel. Unfortunately, the treaty did not explain what channel it was describing, and when an American on San Juan Island shot a pig that happened to belong to the Hudson's Bay Company, and the company threatened to have the man tried for his crime in Victoria, the Americans didn't hesitate. They occupied the island with troops. Britain menaced with a naval vessel, but diplomatically refrained from any further action. The matter went before the German Emperor for arbitration. In 1872, a decision was reached. San Juan belonged to the United States. But meanwhile, the pro-Canadian faction in the colony had been strengthened. And in 1869, Anthony Musgrave became governor of British Columbia. He fought a difficult but successful campaign to convince those citizens still opposed to join Confederation. Canada wanted the land of golden opportunity, and British Columbia by 1870 was willing to join for a price. One popular demand was clearly set down in the February 2nd edition of the British Columbian. Of all the conditions usually attached to a union of this colony with Canada, that of early establishment of a railroad communication from sea to sea is the most important. If the railroad scheme is utopian, so is Confederation. The two must stand or fall together. Canada's reply was reassuring. It would begin a transcontinental railroad within 2 years and complete it within 10. On July 20th, 1871, British Columbia became Canada's 6th province.